Welcome. Thank you for joining our Quality Assurance and Auditing Best Practice Series webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's presentation. Bob Lesniewski, our VP of Quality and Operational Excellence, will be presenting. The discussion today will cover introductions, USDM at a glance, webinar logistics, and our discussion topic, best practices for quality management systems. How do you stack up? We'll invite you to post questions for our team via the iLink message board on the lower left of your screen, and we'll address the questions immediately following the presentation. Bob Lesniewski is our USDM QMS Group Vice President. He has over 25 years in quality assurance and regulatory compliance in pharma, biotech, medical device, nuclear, and petrochemical industries. He leads the USDM quality, auditing, enterprise quality management, and GRC practices. Bob recently led a global QMS implementation across 34 countries. He has functioned as a lead auditor for various pre-FDA PAI readiness assessments, including 10 contract manufacturing organizations throughout Europe and North America for a combined drug device, metered dosage inhaler and antiseptic, injectable, anesthetic, and analgesic product for post-surgical pain management using a proprietary extended-release drug delivery technology. Bob has conducted numerous IT computer system audits for several major life science clients in accordance with GAMP-5, FDA guidelines, and industry best practices. U.S. data management is focused exclusively on the life science domain. We're the market leader in providing IT, quality and regulatory compliance professional service solutions for the regulated industry. We're headquartered in Ventura, California, and we're a compliance partner for many best-of-breed vendors, including Oracle, SAP, TrackWise, OpenText ECM, and Agilent Technologies. We've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 130 life science clients, and we're the preferred compliance partner for small, mid-tier, and large life science companies. We specialize in assisting clients with reducing regulatory risk while maximizing their investment in quality management systems, business intelligence, GRC, laboratory instrument systems, and IT infrastructure. Our directive is to simplify, unify, and optimize compliance and business objectives. The content will be covered in approximately 30 minutes, and then you can interact with our team on the iLink message board. The session will be recorded and posted to the USDM website for later viewing. We invite you to the discussion forum on our LinkedIn and USDM group page as well. We welcome your questions, insight, and feedback and suggestions. If you prefer, you can contact me directly at a later time, and I can arrange a more in-depth discussion with our team. Thanks again for joining us, and now I'll turn the presentation over to Bob.
That's great. Thanks, Becky. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on what part of the country or world you might be in today. We have a very broad audience, including attendees from the West Coast, where it's 11 a.m., the East Coast, where it's 2 p.m., and we have people in Europe and the UK, which is where I'll be presenting from today, where it's 7 p.m. London time. Warm welcome to today's webinar to all of you. As Becky mentioned in her intro, my name is Bob Lesniewski, and I'll be leading today's presentation. So let's get started by taking a look at our agenda. We're going to begin with a brief look at quality management systems and the FDA QSIT approach on QMS during their site inspections. We'll next take a look at what I most often see in terms of the state of compliance and the common approach to quality management systems that I see a lot of companies implementing. We'll continue with a discussion of how to optimize your quality management system by taking a look at a quality management system benchmarking and maturity model which USDM has developed as a simple way to gauge where you are currently at in the maturation cycle and some of the building blocks or fundamentals to move your QMS to the next level. We'll then segue into the meat of today's webinar, which is really a practical discussion on QMS best practices, how to optimize your system, and pitfalls to avoid in your ability to demonstrate that your QMS is operating in a state of control. We'll conclude by taking a look beyond the regulations and summarize the benefits of a solid best practices quality management system. We've got a lot of material to cover in 30 minutes, so let's get started. In terms of background or context to today's discussion, I'd like to begin with a basic question which most quality professionals are frequently asked. How much does quality cost? Well, most companies would have difficulty translating the cost of quality into hard dollars and cents. I think we would all agree, certainly, that a lack of quality could potentially cost millions of dollars, and we see cases of that in the media where companies incur millions of dollars in rework, scrap, warning letters, consent decrees, product recalls, or lawsuits. The basic premise of the regulations and most quality standards is that quality should be built into the product. It can't be tested, inspected, or audited in. And so this really emphasizes the critical importance of your quality management system as the central hub of your enterprise, the one system which is always inspected during FDA inspections, whether it's a full or abbreviated inspection. The diagram here is taken from the FDA's Quality Systems Inspection Techniques, or QSIT, which emphasizes the central role of the QMS in demonstrating a state of control over the reproducibility of manufacturing operations and product safety, quality, identity, purity, and potency, and the controls under which products are designed, manufactured, tested, and distributed. For purposes of our discussion today, we'll be taking a holistic view of QMS and including all of the system areas that you see on this slide. At this point, I'd like to just take a few minutes and briefly share with you a snapshot of what I most often find as the approach to QMS that many companies have taken and some of the pitfalls which you should avoid. I often see a QMS consisting of multiple single-point solutions. There's one application for electronic content management or document control. There's another for training. There's another for change control, with no integration or collaboration between them. I often find a combination of paper-based and partially electronic or hybrid systems. I see layers and silos within organizations to manage the individual components of the QMS, resulting primarily from the multiple single-point solution approach. I see systems more often than not with static metrics. Most of the commercially available packaged QMS applications provide metrics, but they're typically around numbers of deviations, nonconformances, or complaints, and they can be reported per week, per month, per quarter, and by comparison, certainly with similar or prior periods. And while that is very useful, they typically do not report metrics on a relative basis to things like the number of production orders or distribution orders in the supply chain in the manufacturing or ERP system, a true quality metric. It's not uncommon to find solutions which lack the ability to be integrated with other systems. They might manage training records, but they're not integrated with the SOP system. So if SOPs are revised, there's no triggers or notifications to people based on their job profile and their training matrix that their training needs to be updated. They're not integrated with the manufacturing or the ERP system. So when workers scan into a production work order or into a clean room, there's no query that goes out that checks and verifies that the employees' training records are up to date and they should be allowed to scan or log on to that production work order. I often see a great deal of emphasis on CAPA, or corrective and preventive action. And while CAPA is a very important component of quality management system, it's not a QMS in total. For those of you on the call who may be medical device manufacturers, you will certainly recognize that 21 CFR 820, or what's commonly referred to as the QSR, has an entire subsection dedicated to corrective and preventive action. And CAPA has gotten a great deal of regulatory scrutiny across all the GXP areas because of chronic issues that were previously identified, which continue to exist, and which really represent potential for escalation in regulatory enforcement actions. What I typically find also with a lot of companies is that non-value added activities and checks and sign-offs have a way of creeping in. You have an audit by a customer or a regulatory agency, and you layer on additional quality checks or sign-offs. This really amounts to companies throwing money at problems or layering on additional in-process or final checks or sign-offs rather than solving the true root cause. In effect, treating the symptom rather than the disease and emphasizing detection rather than prevention. And finally, I see a lack of emphasis on automated and harmonized processes rather than elimination of a lot of the manual, labor-intensive, and redundant controls that exist. So now that we understand the regulatory basis and the business benefits of a QMS, if you're considering implementing a QMS, or perhaps if you have a current system which may need to be optimized, where do you start or how do you proceed? I think the answer to that question is similar to the cat's response to Alice. It depends on where you want to go. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. So let's look at a model which is a simple means of gauging where you are currently at and some of the systems, benefits, tools, and risks associated with various levels of quality management system maturity. This slide represents a simple diagnostic and benchmarking tool which we employ at USDM to assist our clients as a starting point to determine where they are at, where they want to go, and to help develop a roadmap on how to get there. This model is based on the SEI, or Software Engineering Institute, Capability Maturity Model, and some of you who are familiar with CMM may recognize the basis for this. At level 1, basically the emphasis is on people rather than defined processes. There may be good quality practices, but they're all informal. This level is really characterized by low cost but high regulatory exposure. It's also characterized by a lack of repeatability driven by what I call the hero mentality, or a culture which rewards heroics rather than defined and repeatable processes. The next level, level 2, is where you begin to define at least some of your high-level policies, but the implementation is still done on a project-by-project basis. The emphasis at this level typically is on quality control and testing, and detection and culling out non-conforming materials or products. This level really represents the rudimentary beginnings of a quality system. At level 3, you put in place defined processes and procedures. You begin to achieve consistency and repeatability. You probably have a learning management system, and there's an emphasis on training and starting to focus on not only identifying but reducing defects. You have an audit program, and you may have some third-party quality system accreditation, such as ISO. At level 4, the emphasis is really on establishing a compliance strategy and an overarching quality management system architecture. In order to get to this level from level 3, your processes must be improved. You should really be doing trending, root cause analysis, and there really should be increased emphasis on prevention rather than detection. Level 5 is really the holistic QMS level with integrated components between your electronic content management, your business intelligence, your ERP system, and your training and document management systems. To get to this level, the design of your processes must be improved through various tools such as business process reengineering, quality by design, and value stream mapping. So let's transition at this point from the maturity model to a more practical discussion and review of some of the best practices in several of the key system areas of your quality management system. Let's start with the auditing program. When I'm out performing audits and evaluating companies' audit programs, I often see a lack of depth and really insufficient frequency of audits. What that does is it basically ends up driving a program where the audits tend to be very superficial. So in planning your audit program, your audits need to be of a sufficient frequency and depth. Minimally, every element of your QMS should be audited at least once every 2 years. And if you have areas that are trouble spots, they should be audited more frequently, probably on an annual basis. In terms of depth, you really need to allow sufficient time and have a proper team to do the audit. I often look at internal audit schedules, and I see a very comprehensive audit plan with one individual scheduled for 1 day. And quite honestly, that's just barely enough to scratch the surface for most QMS areas. You really need to have a solid commitment, management commitment to your schedule. Again, I often find a schedule that's been published at the beginning of the year, and when I go into the company, I'm in the third or fourth quarter, and the audits from the first and second quarter, haven't been completed. And they keep getting rescheduled or pushed out. So it's very important to commit to a schedule. Your program should really include characterization of criticality or severity and include trending and should really look for the true root causes and elimination of those. Your audit teams should be cross-functional and should include technical subject matter experts on the audit team. The quality auditors may not always have the technical background necessary to audit certain areas that are, again, highly technical. So if you're auditing your system development lifecycle and coding practices and code reviews and those types of activities, it's rare that you might find a quality auditor that would have that technical expertise. So you really should have a technical subject matter expert to cover those types of functional areas in sufficient depth. Your program should really include effectiveness checks and verification of corrective and preventive action, and should monitor and verify the commitments on a regular basis. You should even consider an audit focused solely on verifying corrective action on a regular basis. The program should include an independent management audit at least once a year. I guess a good way to think about this is the same auditor walking down the hall, every day, sometimes may not begin to see the dust collecting in the corner. So it's a really good practice to have an independent management audit at least once a year to have a fresh set of eyes really taking a look at your program. And the audit program should really be viewed and used as a tool for continuous improvement, not just an exercise, to get your ticket punched and show that you conducted audits according to a schedule, doing the minimum to get by. Next area I'd like to discuss is the QMS area itself. And best practices here certainly would include quarterly management reviews. And the quarterly management reviews, should include detailed regular reviews of metrics and trending, and true quality metrics, not just numbers of deviations and nonconformance reports. I often see when I go into companies, it's very impressive. They have a room with all kinds of charts and graphs, and the room's wallpapered with them. And I usually step back and say, gee, it all looks great. How do you use it to make better business decisions to improve your day-to-day operations? And quite honestly, sometimes clients struggle to provide a solid answer to that. My recommendation in terms of best practices around metrics is focus on the vital few rather than the insignificant many. Aging of CAPAs is very important. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that's a high visibility area, potentially leads to escalation of regulatory enforcement actions. You should have an independent annual management review of the adequacy and effectiveness of your quality management system, and that should include numerous data points that you take into consideration, including certainly your internal audits or self-inspections. Should include all of your external audits, either by your clients or by your regulatory bodies. It should include customer complaints, nonconformances, deviations, out-of-spec reports, out-of-tolerance reports, annual product reviews, change controls. All of those are data points which should go into the overall evaluation of the adequacy and effectiveness of your QMS. Quality and compliance management should be on your executive agenda. It should be highly visible, should be discussed on a regular basis at your quarterly management reviews, along with the important business dimensions like revenue and profit margin and on all the other important business metrics. But quality should have an equal place. And finally, you should leverage cross-functional continuous improvement teams, emphasizing that, like safety, quality is everyone's responsibility, not just that of the QA or QC departments. Another dimension of your QMS that I'd like to look at briefly with you is facilities and equipment. This is a very important area, and your emphasis here should include preventive maintenance programs and records of critical support systems and equipment, including diesel generators, uninterruptible power supplies, HVAC, and transfer switches for your emergency power units, and review of the field service reports. The review of the service reports is important to make sure that open issues that are identified by your service contractor do in fact get addressed. Emergency power is a very important aspect of your facilities and equipment, and the ability to maintain your operation in the event of a loss of offsite power. And so when I go in and typically do an audit, I'm looking at, especially in the case of diesel generators, you should really think about what's the consumption rate of the diesel generator when it's running under full load. What's the size of my fuel oil storage tank? And so based on that, I can do a simple calculation and determine how long will that diesel generator run based on how much fuel I have, and do I have a service level agreement in place for fuel supply replenishment. I often see companies with sophisticated environmental monitoring systems and central monitoring stations, and they spend a lot of money on them, but what I often see lacking is testing your environmental monitoring systems, including periodic alarm testing, so that if temperature or humidity go out of spec and it's monitored by central monitoring, are you testing that so that if you have an out of spec condition, is that alarm really being received by the central monitoring station? And I'm always surprised by the number of companies that have these sophisticated systems but never test to verify that an alarm condition would in fact be received by central monitoring. You should include independent security audits of your building and your IT infrastructure, where the physical and logical security is challenged, and including the site perimeter. Should have a process for alarm monitoring, reporting, and responding, and a notification to either IT group if the HVAC or critical equipment is being serviced, and then a verification of return to service. I was doing an audit of an IT infrastructure for one client, and actually while I was there on site doing the audit, the HVAC system was being serviced. The contractor left, and they forgot to return the system to service, and it was only by chance one of the IT people went into the data center and said, "It seems awfully warm in here," because there was no notification to IT of that whole process. And then finally, there should be a process for deactivation and termination of badges, and as well as network access when employees leave. Another important area of your QMS is computer systems validation, and this area has gotten increased scrutiny by the FDA. They've been hiring a lot of young, computer-savvy inspectors, and we've been seeing a great deal of increased focus and attention to computer systems validation in recent FDA site inspections. So best practices here certainly would include master inventory list, which has all of your computer systems listed, their GSP classification, the date of their validation, their Part 11 assessment, their date of their last periodic review, and when their periodic review is next due. You should have a periodic review process to evaluate the collective impact of change controls. Now, I often see companies that have change control procedures in place, but they fail to step back on a periodic basis and really evaluate the collective impact of the changes that they've had over time relative to maintaining a validated state. You should have a risk-based CSV methodology implemented to scale your validation testing to where the greatest risk exists in the application, rather than a one-size-fits-all where you're testing the plain vanilla same way you are for any configurations or custom code. You should have a defined system development lifecycle and methodology in place, defining what validation artifacts are required for each phase, and include phase gate reviews to make sure, in fact, that those artifacts get delivered. You should have a process for critical patch management, including security patches, and a process to review and prioritize their implementation. I see many companies moving toward VMware and the use of single and multi-tenant hosted applications and compliance in the cloud. But by contrast, I see a lot of companies that really don't have procedures describing how to set up and qualify and validate the use of VMware. You should have, in your acceptable use policy, you should have restrictions on the use of wireless network devices. I've seen some companies that don't address that. In fact, one company, their lab people were frustrated with connectivity to the network. They set up their own wireless device and didn't bother to tell anybody. So continuing with the IT best practices, you should have procedures in place for review of your automatic backup logs and instructions for failures and escalation. I see a lot of companies, again, that have these sophisticated automated backup tools and applications, and they're great. I'm a big believer in them, but what they don't do is go in and review the logs, look for files that we didn't copy or backups that were unsuccessful. And I usually request 30-day logs when I go in and do an audit, and I'm looking to see, if there were files missed, backups that were unsuccessful, and if there are procedures in place for escalation. For remote system access, you need to have VPN controls in place, including tokens, password control, and procedures for user authentication. There's some great tools out there, again, like Identity Manager. I did one audit at a client, and after 5 tries, you got locked out. But if you waited 15 minutes, it would automatically reset your password. Certainly, that's not very good control. You should have a process for review of your disaster recovery and business continuity plan, including a secondary DR site. Plan should be reviewed and tested on an annual basis. And there should be clear definition and division of responsibilities regarding what systems IT supports and at what level. I've often see a lot of lack of clarity between who's responsible for backup. Is it the system owner or the lab, or is it IT? And a lot of confusion and a lot of issues that arise out of that lack of clarity. And then finally, we talked a little bit about hosted applications and service providers. It's very important, if you're going to move in that direction, that you modify your change control procedures, because typically in that instance what happens is that the hosted application may have hot fixes or patches or upgrades that need to get applied, but there needs to be an integration with your change control process, so you get advanced notification of that. You have an opportunity to do your impact assessment and determine what you need to do to maintain the application in a validated state. So in closing, let's take a broader look and look beyond the regulations. Simply establishing a quality management system to meet your regulatory commitments is really kind of analogous to anteing up in a poker game. It's the minimum investment to stay in the game. So let's look at some good business reasons supporting implementation of your quality management system. Clearly, there are a number of business benefits to implementing an aligned and centralized approach to regulatory compliance, including a 34% share price improvement of companies complying with regulations, a 5-to-1 ratio of savings on legal liability avoidance, where every dollar spent on compliance yields a $5 savings on lower legal liability, a lower cost of equity capital for companies complying with the regulations. And while maybe it's a little bit harder to quantify, both Standard & Poor's and Moody's are now assessing organizations' credit worthiness based on compliance breaches. So regulatory enforcement actions like 483s, warning letters, and consent decrees can be very, very costly to a business, not only to its share price, but to its stockholder confidence and public image as well. In closing, or in summary, an integrated enterprise-wide QMS offers many benefits, including allocation of your resources to the most important projects, priorities determined by corporate business objectives, integration of training, document management, employee qualifications, ability to demonstrate control over your quality functions during regulatory inspections, elimination of reactive and firefighting mode, better return on your time, resources, and your money spent, and elimination of the layers and silos, and focus on prevention and continuous improvement rather than detection alone. That concludes the webinar. Thank you for attending. I'll turn the program back to Becky now for a brief wrap-up and to see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Bob. Sure appreciate you sharing that solid information. At this time, we will open the floor to questions. And it looks like our first question is from Frank. Let's see, he's asking, can you elaborate on the differences in change control for a hosted application versus an application on an internal server?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. I touched on that briefly. The real difference, and probably the most important difference there, is that since the application is being hosted and it's not residing on your server, so you really don't have the control over again timing and implementation for things like patches, hot fixes, version upgrades. So your change control process really needs to be modified and integrated with your hosted application provider so that they provide you that advanced notification, and you're aware of what changes are planned and when they're going to take place. And again, you can do the same type of due diligence that you would in your internal change control process by evaluating the change, assessing its impact, determining what you might need to do in terms of validation, what testing might need to occur, and incorporating all of those elements into your normal change control practice. But there's that interface and that communication with the hosted service application provider is critical, and it's typically a significant change to your normal change control process that you really need to put in place. So, great question. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you, Bob. The next question is from Tom. You mentioned a risk-based validation methodology. Can you provide more detail on the critical dimensions and how it might be used to scale validation testing?
Sure. Another great question. Obviously, the audience was really attentive to the discussion. Yeah, I touched on that briefly. So really, in terms of computer systems validation, the best practice is to implement a risk-based approach. And while there's been, a lot of emphasis on that, the FDA certainly condones it. There's also been a lack of clarity and a lot of confusion about how do I implement a risk-based approach and what does it look like. Typically, there's a number of important dimensions. You usually start at the application level, and GAMP has an appendix M3, on risk management. It's a document which I would highly endorse and which we use at USDM. So your first high-level risk assessment is at the application level, where you assess the GAMP classification of the software, and you combine that with the GXP impact assessment. There's 5 software classifications, and then your GXP impact assessment is either direct GXP, indirect, or data integrity only. Following that, if you have a medium or high-risk conclusion based on that application level assessment, you would then drill down to the actual functional level, where you would look within the application at the functionality, and the critical dimensions here would include the severity of a failure of that functionality. So your first rating is on the severity. You typically combine that with the likelihood of occurrence. So severity, high, medium, and low, and likelihood. How likely is it to occur? The combination of those two gives you a risk rating. And then your final dimension, which you incorporate, is probability of detection, because you could have a case where you might have a high or medium severity. It might be high or medium probability of occurrence or likelihood of occurrence, but you could have a high probability of detection because you've designed in automated checks into the application. And the high probability of detection would mean if that scenario were to occur, the system will automatically detect it, and therefore that mitigates the risk and lowers the risk. So you'd ultimately combine those 3 dimensions and come out with a final risk priority rating. And then you would use that risk priority rating to scale your validation testing. So for instance, if something was a low risk priority rating, you might just do some simple positive testing. If you have high risk or medium risk functionality, you would more likely do more robust testing and include boundary testing, limit testing. You do some negative testing, and there's a greater risk that lies in the functionality there, so you would do a much greater extent of testing. So again, another great question. Are there any others, Becky?
No, I think at this time, based on our time limitations, we better wrap up the session. I'd like to remind everybody that the session has been recorded and will be available on our website, typically within 24 hours. We appreciate so much you participating with us today, and thank you, gentlemen, for the good questions here. We ask you to join our discussions on LinkedIn as well. When you have a moment, visit our website, USDatamanagement.com. You can click on the webinar page and you can review the upcoming topics as well as previously recorded webinar sessions which address compliance issues across the various USDM practices. Bob, thank you again for a tremendous presentation, and we appreciate you all taking the time to join us, and we certainly appreciate the opportunity to team with you in working towards excellence in compliance. Have a wonderful day.